Maria Licciardi wasn't carrying a pistol into cafes. She wasn't holding court in public clubs. She wasn't the kind of figure you photograph outside a courthouse and build a headline around. She moved through domestic spaces, through family routines, through rooms that felt too ordinary to be a command center. And that ordinariness wasn't incidental. It was the camouflage. Because the Camorra, especially in that era, was loud on the surface. It wanted you to know it was there. It wanted its reputation to travel faster than any police car. Yet the more you look closely at how an organization like that survives long-term, the more you realize the loudest men are rarely the safest men. Loud men attract attention. Attention attracts pressure, and pressure eventually forces mistakes. The truly durable power in Naples was the kind that could sit inside everyday life and never trigger alarms. Power that could make decisions without announcing itself as a decision. And this is where Maria Licciardi becomes the story the police weren't prepared to tell themselves. Not a decorative wife, not a secondary figure who inherits a seat at the table because of surname, but a leader whose strength was precisely that she did not look like what the state expected a leader to look like. In Italy, they called her La Pizzarella, the little one, and even that nickname worked like a soft blanket over something dangerous. Small, harmless, domestic, easy to underestimate. The kind of person you ignore because your brain has already filed her under not a threat. In an organized crime, being filed under not a threat is sometimes the highest form of protection. So while police dossiers kept filling up with the names of men who were loud enough to be obvious, the real gravity was operating in a different register. Orders didn't always travel through a dramatic meeting. Decisions didn't always arrive as a threat. They arrived as an arrangement, a permission, a quiet shift in who was allowed to do what, and who suddenly wasn't. In Naples, control isn't only about violence. It's about access. Who gets work? Who gets protection? Who gets to move product without friction? Who gets a problem removed before it becomes public? And the terrifying thing about that kind of control is that it can be exercised without raising your voice, without stepping into the street, without ever giving law enforcement the satisfying image of a boss. It's the kind of power that sits in the background and makes the foreground move. And that's why this story starts with the police, not because they're the heroes, but because their blind spot is the key. They were hunting the wrong silhouette, using the wrong instincts, chasing noise. While Maria's strength was silence and placement. She didn't need to be seen to be obeyed. She needed to be central in ways that didn't look central. And once you understand that, the whole case starts to feel unsettling, because it suggests a rule that reaches far beyond Naples. The most dangerous leaders aren't always the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes they look like routine. Sometimes they look like family. Sometimes they look like the last person you'd ever put on a wall of mugshots. And that's the first loop you're stuck with now. If she wasn't the obvious boss, if she wasn't the public face, if she wasn't even the target the state thought it needed, why did so much of the Camorra's modern machine start orbiting around her anyway? Naples in the early 1990s didn't allow a woman to lead the Camorra, so Maria Licciardi didn't ask to be allowed. She built her authority the way the smartest bosses do, by making herself feel inevitable before anyone could argue about titles. The Secondigliano area was already turning into something bigger than a neighborhood crew, an ecosystem where violence could make you feared, but only structure could make you rich. And that's where the Licciardi story stops being about muscle and becomes about architecture. The Secondigliano alliance begins taking shape in the early 1990s around the Licciardi clan, alongside key allies like Edoardo Contini and Francesco Millardo, turning northern Naples into a coordinated power block instead of a collection of feuding street groups. Maria didn't invent that shift alone, but she understood it better than most men who benefited from it. Her camouflage was already written into the nickname Italy gave her, La Pizzarella, the little one. Small enough to be underestimated, familiar enough to be ignored, domestic enough to be misread. And while the police culture of the era kept scanning for the usual silhouettes, flashy capi, visible gunmen, men who collected fear in public, Maria's power grew in the spaces investigators treated like background noise. Family ties, couriers, favors, quiet approvals. The turning point is where the "she just inherited it" myth collapses. By the mid-1990s, the Alliance's male leadership is being removed from the board through prison and death, and multiple accounts describe Maria stepping into real command as that vacuum opens, with reporting noting her rise after her brother Gennaro's death in prison in 1994, when the clan needed someone who could keep the machine running without triggering a street war. That's the core difference in her leadership. She didn't treat power as a performance. She treated it as a system of permissions. Who gets a cell? Who gets protected? Who gets squeezed? Who gets blocked from making money until they remember who the center is? In practical terms, the Licciardi network is repeatedly linked in research and reporting to the kinds of markets that reward organization more than theatrics. Especially the counterfeit and clothing economy in Naples, where control isn't won by one spectacular act, but by quietly owning routes, supply, labor, and enforcement. And that's why her style works so well in a misogynistic underworld. She doesn't argue with the stereotype. She weaponizes it. Men expect a woman to be emotional, secondary, symbolic. So she becomes procedural, central, operational. She puts distance between herself and the most visible violence, not out of softness, but out of discipline. Fewer public scenes, fewer impulsive killings, fewer moments that invite cameras, informants, and heroic headlines for prosecutors. Instead, she leans into the modern Camorra logic: governance over glamour, continuity over ego, which lead to the real wow detail most people miss when they retell her story like a curiosity. If the Alliance is supposed to be a superstructure, the scariest leader isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who can keep multiple clans aligned without constantly spilling blood. And this is exactly where Maria's legend becomes unsettling, because the more order she creates, the less she needs to be seen creating it. So here's the loop that pulls us straight into the next section. If her power wasn't built on public meetings, street rituals, or visible boss behavior, where did people actually go to get decisions approved? And what did it look like when the most consequential choices in Naples were made in a place that felt too ordinary to fear? In Naples, power doesn't always sit in an office. It sits where nobody thinks to look twice, and that's exactly what made Maria Licciardi so hard to see in real time. While police hunted for the usual masculine silhouette of Camorra leadership, men with crews, cars, street corners, visible meetings, she learned to keep authority moving through domestic gravity, the kind that looks like family life from the outside and feels like control from the inside. Her nickname, a Pixarilla, the little one, wasn't just about stature. It became camouflage, a label that encouraged underestimation, even as investigators and courts later described her as a real decision-maker inside the Licciardi system and the Secondigliano orbit. And once you understand that the kitchen isn't a gimmick, it's a strategy. A table is safer than a club, a family apartment is safer than a back room, and a routine visit can hide a meeting better than any coded invitation. The genius is psychological. People don't register a woman moving through homes the same way they register a man making rounds. And in a city where surveillance often begins with pattern recognition, Maria's patterns looked normal: shopping, visits, meals, relatives coming and going. While the actual command moved through permission and access, not volume. One message passed at the right moment. One introduction that quietly signals who is protected and who is isolated. One small decision that reroutes money, manpower, or punishment without ever raising the temperature in public. That's also why a network like the Secondigliano Alliance mattered. It wasn't just muscle, it was coordination, alliances, logistics, influence. Built to survive pressure by distributing function across people and neighborhoods, so leadership could remain semi-invisible even when the state was looking for a single king. And Maria's domestic command style fits that world perfectly because it replaces the obvious headquarters with something more protected: the everyday. If a boss meets in a social club every afternoon, you bug the club. If decisions flow through ordinary touchpoints, Relatives, messengers, quick check-ins that look like family errands. You don't get one clean target, you get fog. That fog is what keeps an organization running when arrests start eating the street layer, because it lets power operate as a process rather than a place. You can picture it. A small apartment, the clink of plates, the TV murmuring in the background, a conversation that, if you don't know the code, sounds like family logistics, but is actually the routing of extortion collection, dispute resolution between crews, discipline for a soldier who freelanced, approval for an alliance, or a warning that a certain name should no longer be spoken out loud. This is how a domestic setting becomes a command room without ever declaring itself one. Because the most effective control doesn't need dramatic meetings. It needs agreement, and agreement is easiest to manufacture where people already come to obey social rules. And that's the unsettling twist for the viewer. The kitchen is where you expect warmth, care, normal life. Yet in this story, it becomes a filter for life and death. Because when the organization is structured, who eats with you can matter as much as who fights for you. Now, here's the detail that makes the whole thing feel real instead of mythic. Years later, reporting around the Licciardi world describes Maria as someone who could move in that ecosystem without triggering immediate suspicion in the way a visible male boss would. And even long after her early arrest era, her name kept resurfacing as a symbol of strategic influence rather than street theatrics. And if you want one of those, wait, what? Moments that captures how domestic-style influence bleeds into hard power. Consider the kind of episode journalists highlight when talking about her profile. Accounts describing her being stopped with a bag of cash, hundreds of millions of lire, linked to an attempt to prevent a collaborator from breaking the code. That isn't cinematic violence, it's risk management, and it's exactly the kind of leadership fingerprint that doesn't require you to carry a gun to move outcomes. So the kitchen command idea isn't that she literally sat there giving mafia speeches. It's that she understood what most people, including many criminals, misunderstand. The safest control is the control that looks like routine, because routine disarms attention. And once you build power that way, you don't need to show dominance every day. The city starts adjusting itself around you without ever being able to point at the moment it happened. But that raises the uncomfortable question that tightens the loop into the next section. If your empire is built to be invisible, if it runs through homes, habits, and normal-looking movement, what finally exposes you? Because sooner or later, even the quietest system leaves one thread sticking out, and all it takes is one patient hand to pull. By the late 1990s, the Camorra is still being described in the language of men who want you to picture it as noise. Guns, street wars, boys on scooters, rage that spills into daylight. And that picture isn't false. It's just incomplete. Because while everyone is staring at the obvious violence, a different kind of power is growing behind it. Quiet, administrative, hard to photograph. And Maria Licciardi is built for exactly that kind of power. She doesn't need to dominate a street corner to dominate a system. She needs control of the decisions that make the streets move. Who gets protection? Who gets punished? Who gets included? Who gets erased? And the terrifying part is how little theater it requires. In Naples, where police are trained to hunt the visible boss, the man with the entourage, the firearms, the late-night meetings, Maria becomes the opposite, a leader whose authority travels through ordinary life, disguised as routine. This is where the Secondigliano alliance turns from a powerful cluster into something closer to a superstructure. An arrangement designed to reduce internal chaos and increase profit through coordination rather than constant war. It's not just one clan bullying one neighborhood. It's multiple clans acting like a merged organism, sharing space, regulating violence when it threatens business, settling disputes through internal rules instead of endless retaliation. Scholars and case-based writing on the Camorra describe how these alliances function less like a single pyramid and more like a network boardroom. Coalitions that can expand, absorb, and outlast purely street-based factions. And Maria's role inside, that shift, is exactly why the public story misses her for so long. She's not selling an image. She's selling stability. Because stability is a weapon in organized crime. It sounds boring until you realize what it does. Stability means money can repeat. Routes can stay predictable. People stop panicking. Internal drama becomes punishable, not normal. And when you can enforce stability, you don't need to be the loudest person in the room. You become the person the room depends on. That's the thing about domestic power. It doesn't look like power, but it decides what happens next. So the myth of a woman in the kitchen isn't a quirky detail in this story. It's the camouflage. It's the reason her nickname worked. They called her La Pixarella, the little one, and for years that sounded like something you'd say about someone harmless. But in reality, it functioned like a permission slip for everyone else to underestimate her. And the mechanics of her empire follow that same logic. Don't create a scene, create a system. Decisions don't need a public meeting if they can move through daily contact. You don't need an office if you can turn a home into a checkpoint. You don't need to raise your voice if everyone already knows what your silence means. In this phase, the Camorra's control isn't just fear. It's governance. Who mediates conflicts, who sets limits, who decides when violence is allowed and when it is bad for business. And this is where Maria becomes most dangerous to investigators, because she operates like a manager, not an actor. The men around her can be noisy. She doesn't have to be. Their noise becomes her decoy. So imagine what that looks like on the ground. A neighborhood doesn't feel like it's ruled by a single tyrant. It feels like it's ruled by procedures. You want to work? You need permission. You want to move goods? You need help. You want your shop to stay calm? You pay for calm. You want a dispute to disappear? It disappears if the right person agrees. And when the right person is someone the police aren't even building a file around, the empire becomes harder to cut because there's no obvious head to strike. That's the grim equation. When power is invisible, it becomes almost impossible to destroy cleanly. You can arrest soldiers, but the machine survives. You can raid a corner, but the system reroutes. You can remove a loud man, but the quiet one keeps the calendar. And the more the alliance succeeds, the more it begins to feel normal to the people inside it. That's how criminal systems become durable. Not through constant terror, through routine, through predictability, through an economy of favors and consequences that makes resistance feel irrational. Maria's strength isn't that she invents crime. It's that she makes crime administrative. A decision doesn't need to look like a threat. It can look like a schedule change. A punishment doesn't need to happen in the street. It can happen through isolation, denial of work, a door quietly closing. This is why the kitchen detail matters psychologically. A domestic space is the last place people imagine governance. They think governance needs uniforms, offices, titles, weapons. But the truth, especially in Naples, is that governance can exist wherever the people with the most accurate information sit. And that's another underappreciated layer of her power: information. Men who lead through spectacle are often surrounded by noise. Too many mouths, too many egos, too many friends who repeat what they hear. Maria's method naturally filters that. Fewer outsiders, fewer big gatherings, more private contact, more plausible deniability. A home is a natural privacy machine. People don't barge in the way they do at bars or social clubs. People don't openly surveil a kitchen the way they surveil a street corner. People don't treat domestic space as intelligent space until it's too late. So while the police keep chasing the idea of power as a visible target, her empire keeps running like a quiet utility. But here's the tension that makes this section not just wow, she was smart. Because invisibility isn't immortality. It's a strategy, and strategies create habits. And habits always create a weak seam somewhere. The bigger the system becomes, the more it requires coordination. The more coordination you need, the more messages move. The more messages move, the more chances you create for one message to be heard by the wrong person, repeated at the wrong time, carried by someone who's scared, angry, or trying to save themselves. Every invisible empire eventually meets the same enemy. Not bravery, not morality, Astor's pressure star. And pressure doesn't always arrive in a dramatic raid. Sometimes it arrives as patience, as surveillance that waits, as an investigation that stops looking for the movie boss and starts looking for the person the movie boss keeps checking with. So at the height of her control, when she's least visible, the fall is already forming in the only place it can form, inside the network itself. Because the only way to bring down a leader who never shows herself is to make the structure speak. And structures speak through tiny failures. One careless contact, one person who flips, one assumption that a domestic room is always safe. And that's the question we're walking into next. If Maria's power was built on never being seen, what finally forces the empire to reveal its center? Just once. Long enough for the state to grab it? Maria Licciardi didn't run her world like a movie boss, so her downfall doesn't arrive like a movie either. No convoy chasse, no rooftop escape, no last stand with sirens and gunfire. The thing that finally starts closing around her is slower, uglier, and much harder to fight: patience. Because when a leader builds power through normal life, family routines, quiet meetings, domestic spaces, the state can't beat her with one dramatic raid. It has to beat her by learning her rhythms, mapping her ecosystem, and waiting for the smallest human mistake to surface. And that's the part outsiders underestimate. A kitchen command structure feels invisible, but still has to breathe. Money still has to move. Orders still have to travel. People still have to be paid. Someone still has to enforce discipline, even if the enforcement is done with whispers instead of bullets. Over years, that creates the one thing Maria tried to avoid: repetition. Not repetition of violence, repetition of contact. The same intermediaries, the same trusted faces, the same collection points, the same quiet system of a clan casa that keeps families loyal, because a hungry wife becomes a collaborator faster than any moral sermon ever could. And the irony is that her greatest strength becomes the trail. She's credited with keeping the clan cohesive by taking care of the internal economy, supporting families of imprisoned affiliates, keeping defections rare, treating loyalty like something you fund as much as something you demand. That's not soft power. That's engineering. It's also exactly the kind of behavior prosecutors can describe as leadership without needing a photo of her holding a gun. If money distribution becomes proof of command, then even caretaking becomes evidence. By the early 2000s, that slow pressure finally produces the first major break in the myth. Maria Licciardi is arrested and goes to prison in 2001. Later, she's released in 2009, and accounts describe that period as the moment she returns to take full control, not as a symbolic figure, but as the one setting the internal order and territorial structure. The timeline matters psychologically. It shows how resilient her model was. Prison didn't erase her authority. It forced it to evolve. The clan's logic didn't depend on her being seen in public. It depended on her being treated as the reference point inside the system. That's what makes her story unsettling. You can't decapitate a structure like this with one arrest the way you might with a leader who rules through fear and constant street presence. You remove her, and the machine still runs. You release her, and the machine doesn't restart. It just tightens. Because a leader who survives that kind of pressure comes back with one obsession: reducing exposure even further. Fewer open conversations. More sentinels. More distance. More control over who speaks to whom and where. And yet, something changes in the wider environment too. The state becomes better at describing Camorra governance as governance. Not a violent neighborhood problem, but a system with zones, capizona figures, revenue streams, and conflict management. Exactly the kind of invisible empire the Secondigliano alliance was accused of representing. Maria's clan is described as a top element of that alliance. And when investigators believe they're looking at a confederation, Contini, Millardo, Licciardi, then the pressure stops being local and starts becoming strategic. They aren't trying to catch a crime. They're trying to document a boardroom that hides inside daily life. So the fall doesn't come from one loud betrayal. It comes from accumulation, small investigations that keep thickening, surveillance that keeps improving, political permission that keeps growing. And when that pressure builds, the domestic camouflage becomes less magical. Because domestic spaces only feel safe until the state learns they're being used as offices. Then the kitchen becomes what it always was. Just another room with walls that can be watched, routines that can be mapped, and people who eventually get tired of carrying risk for someone else's longevity. And this is where the story starts turning darker than she got arrested. Because the real punishment isn't the handcuffs, it's the way an invisible ruler becomes a public priority. In later years, authorities explicitly describe her as a top leader, and when they start using that language out loud, it changes everything. It changes how aggressively they pursue her network, how much manpower gets assigned, how many angles they attack at once. At that stage, the state isn't hunting a woman. It's hunting the idea that power can hide forever behind a domestic mask. So the question isn't, how did she finally get caught? The question is, what do you do when your entire method depends on being underestimated, and suddenly you're not underestimated anymore? Because in the next section, you feel the net tighten in a modern way. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through a multi-front squeeze. Money, territory, surveillance, and the one thing even the best-run clan can't fully control: the human need to talk when the pressure gets personal. Maria Licciardi didn't build her power by acting like a boss. She built it by solving the one problem Naples' underworld never stops bleeding from: chaos. The Camorra doesn't naturally behave like a single machine. It behaves like dozens of families with their own pride, their own tempers, their own little wars. And that's exactly why the Second Agliano alliance mattered. It was an attempt to coordinate clans the way a corporation coordinates departments, so the money could flow without the city constantly catching fire. Scholars analyzing Camorra conflict patterns explicitly describe a 1998 to 1999 conflict involving the Second Agliano alliance, Contini, Licciardi, and Millardo, against another clan alliance. Evidence that this wasn't a local crew, but a recognizable coordination block inside Naples' criminal ecosystem. And this is where Maria's method becomes terrifying, because an alliance doesn't just multiply profits, it multiplies invisibility. If police focus on a single boss, you survive by not being the boss on paper. If police focus on a single clan, you survive by becoming the quiet bridge between clans, the person who turns rivalry into scheduling. A man can look powerful in the street and still be easy to target, but someone who can make different groups cooperate without ever needing a public throne, that person becomes harder to even define, and prosecutors hate what they can't draw in a simple chart. So Maria's influence expands through something that looks ordinary: introductions, permissions, the right word passed at the right time, the kind of soft power that makes other men feel like they're choosing freely, when really they're being guided. The alliance makes the drug economy more stable, makes extortion more predictable, makes territory less contested and more managed. Because instability is expensive. Every feud attracts informants. Every funeral creates witnesses. Every body creates pressure. And Maria's whole advantage was that she didn't need drama to win. She could treat violence like a cost, not a language. Regulate it. Aim it. Reduce it when business demanded calm. Unleash it when a message had to be sent. Then pull everything back into routine before the city could understand what it had just seen. That's why the kitchen angle isn't just a cool detail. It's the perfect metaphor for how the alliance worked. Domestic on the surface, industrial underneath. You don't need a war room if the real power is controlling the yes and no behind everyone else's decisions. You don't need to be photographed if the system keeps moving without you. And over time, her camouflage gets reinforced by the oldest bias in policing: the instinct to search for power where it has always looked masculine. Cars, clubs, visible entourages, while the real center of gravity sits somewhere that looks too small to matter. That is exactly how a figure like Maria can be underestimated for years, then later described by major Italian reporting as a top leader of the clan, caught not in some cinematic shootout, but through patient state pressure and an arrest that happens at the most ordinary place in the modern world: an airport with a ticket, trying to move quietly like anyone else. And that's the tension tightening now, because the higher you climb through invisibility, the more your downfall depends on something tiny. One intercepted message, one meeting that happens twice, one courier who gets nervous, one routine that repeats, just enough for investigators to stop guessing and start proving. So the question isn't whether Maria was powerful at the Alliance's peak. The question is what finally made the state confident enough to reach into a structure designed to leave no fingerprints. Because in the next section, the first real cracks appear, and they don't look like a war. They look like patience. By the time Maria Licciardi becomes a name prosecutors are willing to say out loud, the real story isn't that she was hiding. It's that she didn't need to hide in the way people expect, because her entire method was built around never looking like what the state was trained to hunt. In Naples, cops are taught to look for the visible signals of male power. Crews on corners, men with reputations, the social club, the ritual of intimidation performed in public. But Licciardi's power lived inside a different texture. Domestic normality, family proximity, decisions delivered through relationships that didn't require a street stage. And that's why the net tightens the way it always tightens against an invisible empire, slowly, patiently, by learning the ordinary. Not one huge mistake, a series of small points that finally connect. Investigators describe her as a top figure in the Licciardi clan and the broader Camorra structure tied to Naples, with prosecutors framing her as a madrina who helped make decisions at the top level. And when the state starts treating you like leadership, it stops trying to catch you doing a crime and starts trying to prove you are the system. The person who steadies it, coordinates it, protects it, and benefits from it. That shift matters because it changes the kind of evidence that becomes lethal. Not a gun, but patterns. Not a dramatic meet, but the quiet logistics of extortion, mediation, discipline, and the enforcement of obedience in neighborhoods where fear can pass as order. Prosecutors allege she ran extortion rackets, and the framing is cold because it doesn't need mythology. You pressure businesses, you regulate disputes, you decide who pays and who gets punished, and the city learns to treat that pressure like weather. What makes this phase unsettling is how uncinematic it is. The fall of a domestic-style leader doesn't come with a chase through alleys or a shootout outside a nightclub. It comes with travel plans, check-in counters, a warrant waiting like a silent hand on your shoulder. On August 8th, 2021, authorities arrest Licciardi at Ciampino Airport in Rome as she's about to board a flight to Spain, a moment that feels almost insulting in its simplicity. The woman nicknamed a Pixarella, the Little One, the woman long underestimated as a small figure, stopped in a place designed for ordinary departures. The symbolism is perfect and brutal, because it's the reverse of street power. No crew around her, no loud protection, just procedure. And the state doesn't present it as a lucky grab. It presents it as the result of prosecutors and carabinieri units treating her as a leadership target, not a background character. Then the story gets even colder. The system she used as camouflage, routine, the banality of normal life, becomes the very thing the government weaponizes. Court proceedings later recognize her not merely as affiliated, but as a leader with a sentence of 12 years and 8 months in a fast-track proceeding, described as the first conviction that formally recognizes her leadership role in that clan structure. The same reporting notes she's held under carcere duro, the regime designed to cut command and control from inside prison. And here's the psychological sting. Even in a downfall, her story refuses spectacle. The state's message isn't "we beat her in the street." It's "we isolated her from communication." That's what modern anti-mafia pressure looks like. Less about a heroic arrest and more about severing the invisible wires, the ability to give direction, to arbitrate conflict, to keep the machine calm. The reporting also sketches how long this battle has been, noting earlier arrests and prison time in her history, and how investigators interpreted money, mediation attempts, and internal discipline as evidence of high-level influence rather than mere association. But the most important part, especially for an audience that already knows the Camorra, is what her capture reveals about the kind of power she represented. A style that doesn't need public fear because it turns fear into routine and routine into compliance. And that raises the final question the story has been building toward since the first minute. If her empire ran best when it looked like nothing, what happens when the state finally forces it into the light? Does it collapse, mutate, or simply keep operating without her, as if the kitchen was never the true headquarters at all? Because that's where the last section goes. Not just to her sentencing, but to the legacy, what her reign changed inside Naples, what it taught the Camorra about leadership, and why the most terrifying criminal power sometimes sounds like plates being set on a table, not a gun being cocked. By the time the early 2000s arrive, Maria Licciardi has already proven the most unsettling lesson in modern organized crime. You don't need to look dangerous to be dangerous, and you don't need to be loud to be obeyed. In fact, the quieter she stayed, the more the system around her hardened into routine. That was her real invention. Not a new crime, but a new texture of power, one that could live inside domestic space, inside ordinary rhythms, inside the kind of environment where police instincts don't naturally scream boss. And for years, that camouflage worked because investigators were trained to chase the theater, the gunmen, the visible chiefs, the public rituals. Maria's leadership lived in the opposite direction, in the private, the repetitive, the unremarkable. But here's the part that makes her downfall feel almost cruel. The end doesn't come from a dramatic collapse. It comes from a modern reality she spent her whole reign trying to avoid. Pressure that accumulates quietly, evidence that doesn't need witnesses to be brave, and an investigative focus that stops chasing people and starts chasing systems. Because an empire like Secondigliano doesn't only leave bodies. It leaves traces. It leaves money movement, property patterns, sudden promotions, unusual protection, unusual access, the invisible fingerprints of governance. And once prosecutors stop asking who pulled the trigger and start asking who kept the machine stable, Maria becomes easier to see. There's an irony in the timeline that matters psychologically. Her power rises through the 1990s as the Secondigliano alliance becomes a kind of criminal superstructure, a cartel logic more than a street crew logic, with influence that extends beyond the neighborhood into laundering, counterfeit goods, and reinvestment channels that blur into the legal economy. Corrier's reporting describes her as taking control after her brother's death in 1994 and highlights how investigators long understood her role, even before courts formally stamped it. And that's exactly why the fall is so unnerving. The state doesn't discover her in one heroic moment. It slowly builds a shape around her until the mask stops working. Then, when it finally happens, it's not cinematic. It's procedural. She's arrested in 2001 and ends up spending years in prison on a final conviction for Camorra association, a stretch that effectively removes her from the surface while her myth keeps circulating under the surface. But prison doesn't erase an operator like Maria. It just changes her operating conditions. Corrier notes she was held under harsh detention conditions, including time in the high-security regime, and even references the 2009 L'Aquila earthquake period while she was incarcerated, which becomes a strange metaphor for her whole story. The ground shakes, the world panics, but the structure she built was designed to survive instability. And yet the deeper twist is that her fall is not a single fall. It's a pattern of returns. Because what makes someone like Maria so hard to end isn't only fear, it's the way her leadership style fits into modern chaos. When violence is loud, the state can justify big reactions. When power is quiet, it takes longer to prove. And that time lag creates room for survival, room for reentry, room for influence to persist through proxies, family ties, and habits that keep running even when the original architect is gone. That's why the later chapter hits like a cold punch. Years after that earlier imprisonment, she's arrested again in August 2021 at Rome's Ciampino airport while allegedly trying to leave for Spain. The detail is almost poetic because Spain is exactly the kind of normal exit route quiet bosses prefer. Not a dramatic escape, just a flight, a bag, a gate number, a plan that assumes bureaucracy is blind. Both Courier and L'Espresso described the airport arrest and the attempted flight to Spain, framing it as the capture of a figure long considered central to the alliance's power. And here the story reveals its most modern horror. Even at the end, Maria Licciardi still doesn't look like the stereotype. No palace, no throne, no cinematic command center. The legend is that she ran an empire from her kitchen, and whether you imagine that literally or symbolically, the point is the same. She understood that the safest place to command isn't where power usually sits. It's where power is dismissed, where people lower their guard, where meetings can be disguised as family life, where decisions can be framed as nothing. That was her camouflage, and that camouflage is exactly what delayed consequences for so long. But consequences always arrive eventually, and they arrive in the language Maria could never intimidate. Sentences, courts, formal recognition. In 2023, Courier reports that a court decision recognized her as a boss figure of the alliance. A milestone not because investigators didn't know, but because the law finally said it out loud. And that detail matters for your audience, because it separates myth from proof. A woman long treated as a shadow becomes, officially, a leader in the written record. The kitchen stops being an anecdote and becomes evidence of method, a domestic strategy used as organizational cover. So what's the real ending? It's not her arrest. It's the idea she leaves behind in the criminal ecosystem. Because Maria's reign quietly rewired the imagination of what leadership can look like in European organized crime. Less spectacle, more administration, fewer public rituals, more private governance, less visible intimidation, more invisible leverage. And once that template exists, it doesn't disappear with one person. It spreads. It teaches. It inspires the next generation of power to hide inside ordinary life. That's why our story ends with a discomfort instead of a clean moral. For decades, the Camorra believed power had to be carried in the hand, a gun, a threat, a public reputation you could feel in the street. Maria Licciardi proved a darker alternative. The most stable empire in Naples can be built where nobody is looking, inside routines people don't question, in rooms that feel harmless until you realize they're making decisions about who eats, who works, who disappears. And if that idea stays with you, good, it should. Because once you understand this kind of power, you start noticing it everywhere. And if you want more stories of gangsters whose falls were just as horrifying, not loud, but inevitable, we've put a full playlist of tragic, enigmatic downfalls waiting for you right here.